Hey everyone, what is up? Welcome to this episode of how to build threads from scratch using React Native, Supabase, and GlueStack. In this episode, we're going to actually go through creating a user with a username. So in the previous episode, we did the login method. The person's login, we have a session token. They've created a quote-unquote Supabase user. But we're not going to use the Supabase user because we want to be able to add our own custom fields like an avatar, a username, or any other information we want to use. And so we're going to create our own user table that can kind of work alongside of the default Supabase table. That just gives us more flexibility. You could join to other tables. You could find that user. It just makes it a lot more consistent. And so we have this person, they're able to log in, but they don't actually have a user yet, because if we go to Supabase, we don't have any tables. So if we reload, we want to add a user table here so that we can start adding information. So we can go to the next step after this one. They could create an account and then they could add a username to their user object. And then once we have that user object, we're going to set it and we're going to use that same object when they navigate the app, when they like an item, when they repost an item, when they post an item. We're going to use that user object. So first thing we want to do is we want to instantiate the database instance. So we're going to use Prisma to be able to manage some of the data, and we're only going to use it locally. So we can see, like, I put it in here, npx install prisma -- save -dev, and that's because we're only going to use it to update the database and manage the schema. We're not going to use the ORM part. So we're going to use just regular Supabase. So Supabase.let's find user. Prisma has their own version of that. But specifically for React Native, it's still in like a native early access mode, and there's a lot of extra steps. So I am excited to use this once it is kind of in a production mode, and I can use it in another project moving forward. But for right now, we're just going to use regular old Prisma to manage and our migrations and update the database. So the first thing we're going to do is npm install Prisma, not with a quote because I accidentally clicked something. And then we're going to init that database with a Postgres instance. So you could use Prisma with different types of databases. So that's why it's cool. You don't have to get stuck into one kind of ecosystem. If you use Supabase and you use Prisma, maybe in the future you want to migrate off of Supabase into a different database. You can do that because all your data all your data structure is being managed with Prisma, not Supabase directly. You can run migrations with Supabase, but I think Prisma is a lot more clear. You can manage it, the schema and whatnot. So when we run Prisma init, it gives us a couple steps. We could set the database URL in the .env, and then we run Prisma db pull, and then we could stop right there. Prisma generate is for the ORM, the Prisma client, and you can see it's referencing the ORM here. So we don't need to do all the steps. And then up here, we already added the database URL to our .env file. And it's going to follow this structure: Postgres : // and then your Supabase username : Supabase password. The default usually is aws.0-us-1. So I would just double check that. And this is the big part, the port number, 5432. If we go to our threads accounts, go home, if we click connect, the default you can see is the same format: Postgres, our username, the password. We have US West 1, but we have 6543. That's the port for that. But why do we have 543? And that's because there's two different types of URLs. There's a connection string, like a connection puller. So this is the type of URL that we want to use if we're using the ORM. So let's say we did like prisma.find.user in our React Native app. This is the URL we want to use. So this is the database URL, the puller URL. But there's also a direct URL. So you can see if I unclick this, we get a little bit of a different format. So 5432. So the port is different. And so the format's a little bit different too. So yeah, you can see this puller.5432. So we want to use this one. And that allows us to do migrations. And you're going to use, if you're using the wrong one, if you were to run a we don't want to do the pool. Well, actually, we can do the pool. If it were to get stuck, so on either this DB pull or the DB push, what are we getting now? Intersect database was empty. Okay, this makes sense because we have no database. So there's nothing for it to pull down just yet. But let's say we were to run that one or this next command of npx prisma db push. If it were to just like get stuck, it doesn't error out, but it doesn't actually do anything either. That means you have the wrong URL and the wrong port. So you just want to double check that. Pretty common error to come across. So we want to actually push up our changes. But first thing we want to do is, this is the default file that it created. So it's Prisma client.js. We're using a Postgres database. We have this environment variable database URL. If we go to README, I added a few extra things. This Postgres extensions and this UUID OSSP. I don't actually know what that stands for, but it allows us to use a database generated UUID string. So it's just like a collection of numbers and letters with dashes, a random string for our ID, instead of like the default is just a number value that increments. So the first user would be ID number 1, the second user would be ID number 2. So what we're actually going to do is just copy and paste this and we get to overwrite the whole thing. The other thing is just default documentation. So this stays the same, and this is what's new here. This is what's new here, and then this is how we use it. This default DB generated. So let's go line by line. The ID is a string, and it's the ID. Every table has to have one ID. So this main value that we're going to find things on. And the at default is saying that, okay, when we push, let's say we were to insert a new user into the table, all we really need to pass in, actually, since this is optional, all we really need to pass in is just like an empty object, and it'll create a row. If we were to make it required, which honestly, the username should be required. I don't know why I had that as optional. Then we would just need to pass in the username. That's unique, so it couldn't have already been created already. And then this ID and created that will automatically get created because we're using the at default. So this one, the at default, is using DB generated. This is very well named because you can see that the database is generating this ID and inserting it as the ID. We're going to pass in this username and make sure it's unique. If it's not unique, if someone has a username of Tim and you try to create another username of Tim, it's just going to fail. So that's what we want. The avatar is optional for right now because we're not going to force them to create an avatar right on sign up. And then created at is just an easy way to track your users and when things were created. Default time is right now. So this is also generated by the database. So how do we get these changes up to Supabase? It's this line right here, dbx prisma db push, or npx. I don't know why I said dbx. So if we reload this, we have no database right now. But let's save these changes to our schema and run prisma db push. And remember, if it gets stuck here, that means you have the wrong URL. You want to double check that port number. Okay, now that we ran the command, we could see, if we go back to Supabase, reload, we don't even have to reload. We could see the user table is now generated. And we're actually going to run across an error with this RLS disabled for right now, but we're going to see what that looks like in a second. So we're not going to touch anything, but we have our table up and ready. So now we want to actually insert into that table. So if we go to our username file, we have this handle username function. And right now we're just logging in the username. But this probably is something that we want to add into our provider. So maybe do const create user. And then Supabase.from user from the user table. So make sure this matches the model name user. And then we're going to insert the username. And then, like I said, everything else this ID will automatically get generated. This needs to be unique. Avatar is optional with this question mark. And then created at will automatically get created. And then we're just going to log the response. So we want to pass it down. add it to our context. We're going to pass in username as a string. And there we go. So now we should have access to const create user from use auth. Okay, so once it creates a user, we're just going to log the data. But we probably want to call this eventually. Let's make sure this works first. Okay. So let's just enter username of Tim and create an account. So on press, putting in a button text of create account, handle username, and it should call create user. So let's click it. It's logging Tim here and responding with null. So something went wrong. Let's reload. Oh, here we go. Okay, so null. Okay, that reminds me actually. So null, you would think typically when you enter into the database, if it's successful, it returns that object. But with Supabase, you have to put dot select. And then if we were to do this again, actually let's just do two different things. First thing we're going to do is try to create a user with the same username. So Tim. And it's going to yell at us, Tim already exists, and that's because we put in this unique restraint. So let's just put 2 M's. And then this time, it should log the response. So there we go. So it logs the response as an array, interestingly enough. And there we go. We have our avatar created at ID and the username. So now we should have 2 users if we reload. Yep, there we go. Okay, so now that we have the user, we want to be able to actually set the user and use that user once they log in. So here data, let's say const user equals data 0, set user. And we want to do like if error return console.error. So if there's an error, it'll never hit this line. If there is no error, we want to set the user. Okay, so one change I do want to make now that I'm thinking about it is we want to actually, instead of having the database decide what the ID is, we want to pass in the ID from the actual user. So the user from Supabase. So remember, we have this session token. We have this session token, and in that token, looks like we're not logged in right now. And in that token, we have an ID. And so we want to associate the Supabase user with the database user that we just created. So instead of this ID, we want to just insert ourselves. So what we're going to have to add is ID session.user.id. Oh, perfect. Then we want to select it, and then we want to do it. So we just made a change to the database already. So how do we do that? So we want to do push again. So we can create a migration, but since we're making so many different changes, I just like to use push in the beginning because I don't need to track the change of like updating a field just yet. Once you're in production, you're going to want to use migrations. Because you'll see in a second that if we do push, remember it's like -F, it's a force. So if we ran this again with this change, it's going to at least warn us. It should have warned us. Well, let's see what happens. Oh, I guess I could still use. Okay, let's see if we were to remove this field and then do a push, then it should warn us because it doesn't exist anymore. There you go. Okay, so it says when applying these changes, you're about to drop the column username, which still contains 2 non-values. So if you click ignore, it'll push it, it'll overwrite it. And we can see the field is now gone. So actually we want that, but we want to just have the ID and then run another db push. So I just wanted to be able to show you the warning that'll show you when it drops a column. Oh, here's another one. And then added the required column username to the user without a default value. And so since username is required in our schema and it doesn't exist right here, in this scenario, you'll see all of your data will be lost. So at least it gives you pretty good warnings. And if you click this, yes, this time, then it'll, if we go back to our database after this runs the migration and click reload, it'll be empty. Yes, there we go. And so, yeah, there we go. Those are some very default functions and error messages that you'll come across. So make sure you read everything. Of course, everything in red. It'll probably overwrite all of your data, so be careful with that. Okay, so now we have our changes to our table. Have handle username, create user. Honestly, we don't even need the function. Create user, and then an auth provider. We're creating the user with the session.user.id, and then then we want to add another function to get user. So here, const. So we want to be able to, from the user table, select where the ID equals session.user.id. So this is why we're going to replace the ID with the session ID, so that we could use this functionality to, on Supabase.getSession, that user, quote unquote user from Supabase, has an ID that we're just going to use as our table ID as well. And then see, we have select here, so it's actually going to return one item. So we could pass in data. So if we just log data here, it'll be the user, but we want to pass in, we don't want to create the user, but we want to be able to set the user. Set user with data. And I don't think it's an array for this one, but let's double check. Anyway, we have this session, and in here somewhere is the user. Here we go. So session dot user dot ID. It might have actually already logged us in because we have all the steps. So we have log data. And let's just log the error as well. Okay, permission denied for schema.public. So this is what I was talking about earlier. So we were able to add into the database, insert into the database, but we have our permission so that you can't read from the database as well. So in development, when we're adding, removing, updating tables all the time, what I put in the README was kind of just a workaround, and just think of it just as that, as a workaround for now. And that's because it just opens up all the tables for development to be able to just make them public. So if we were to run this one more time, and you have to, the reason I put this in here is because you have to change it every single time you add a table, and we're not going to add all the tables at once. We're going to keep on modifying it, and it just gets annoying sometimes to be able to keep on running it. We want to come back eventually in the future. So in the future, we want to have anyone to be able to create a user, but and also to be able to read a user, but you don't want anyone to be able to update a user. So that user object should be unique to that person logged in. So you want to make sure those IDs of the person logged in matches the ID of the user that they're trying to update. So if we were to reload this, go to auth provider, and this time it gives us an empty array, which is not what we want either, but it's also not giving us an error, so that's progress. So let's make sure we're logging the right thing. So the reason it's getting called is because of this effect. We have the session token already, so it's setting the session token, and then it's getting the user. So we're passing in that session token here. Honestly, we don't even need to store the session token. We can just pass it down. Actually, you know what? I'll just keep it for now. But it's passing in the get user, and it's passing in session. If there's a session, then get that session ID from the user. So let's make sure this is the right thing. Okay, that's correct. Oh, but we don't actually have a user. So that's why it's not finding anything that would do it. So let's log out. Let's try this all over again. So now we're going to create a user. Okay, again, we're going to create Tim. We're going to create account. Okay, it created our user, Tim, and then the ID C44 should match the ID that we were logging. Yes, on the session ID. So get user, select ID. So we console log data.error. Oh, so data is an array. Okay, so what we want to do is set user with data if no error. And then we want to push two tabs. So this means the user already exists. So we want to skip the username page and then redirect to tabs. So there we go. So on session, and let's reload real quick, and it should redirect us home. Okay, there we go. Whew, just hit all the errors we possibly could, but we're finally logged in. So let's recap what we just did. So we created a new user in the database. It's using the ID of the session so that the user from Supabase matches the user we have in the user table. And that's because that allows us to use this supabase.auth.get session. In session, we have session.user.id, and we could find the user by that, and so they don't have to log in every single time. It's returning it as an array, so we're going to pass in the first item, that user. So since ID is unique, that array should always be just one item long. So we're just always going to get the first item, and then we're going to redirect to home page, so /tabs. If we go to the username page and we call get create user, we're going to insert with that ID and the username, and we're going to select because we want to return the item. Again, it's an array of items, an array of users. It should always just be one. We're going to set that user. So now we have this user object. We're just doing that for log. So now we have this user object available to us throughout. So right now we go to home, index. If we import user from user auth, and we can see home Tim. So there we go. That's our full sign in, sign up method. We could even like log out again, and we could log in again. If I put in the right phone number, I think I put too many digits in. Yep. And then it goes to home again. So we have the full flow. You could add as many pages to this like onboarding flow as you want. There's a lot of apps, like I said, that have a full onboarding flow to kind of enable some features, but also like you could have a whole page just to upload your avatar, or maybe enable notifications or location services, and then teach them about the app as well. And so in the next episode, we're going to start with the homepage and be able to create posts so that this user can actually create and view posts from their Threads account. So hope you join me. Hope you like this video, and like and subscribe, and see you next time. Peace.